Hey guys! Tonight we're peeling back the romantic veneer of Valentine's Day to reveal the dark, blood-soaked origins that medieval people would have recognised immediately but that modern candy hearts and flower bouquets have carefully hidden from view. You're standing in a Roman prison cell in the year 269 AD, watching a Christian priest named Valentine perform illegal wedding ceremonies for soldiers who have been forbidden to marry, knowing that each blessing he whispers could cost him his life. The air reeks of dampness and fear, torch flames casting dancing shadows on stone walls that have witnessed countless executions. While outside you can hear the distant roar of crowds gathering for what they don't yet know will become one of history's most romantically celebrated martyrdoms. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why Valentine's Day sometimes feels more anxiety-inducing than romantic, or why medieval people seem to understand that love and death walk hand in hand in ways that modern culture prefers to ignore. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to let me know where and when you started watching, or share what draws you to these darker corners of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about traditions we take for granted. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You watch as Roman soldiers drag Valentine from his cell, his priestly robes torn and blood-stained from weeks of interrogation that have failed to break his determination to continue performing Christian marriage ceremonies despite Emperor Claudius II's explicit ban on military weddings. The emperor believed that married soldiers made poor warriors, too concerned with returning home to wives rather than dying gloriously for Rome, so he outlawed marriage for young men in his army. Valentine's crime wasn't just religious defiance. It was undermining imperial military policy through the dangerous act of sanctifying romantic love that authorities considered subversive to state power. The mainstream historical fact that shapes Valentine's martyrdom reflects the brutal reality of Roman religious persecution. Christians who refused to renounce their faith faced systematic torture designed to break their will before public execution served as entertainment and warning to other potential dissidents. Archaeological evidence from Roman execution sites reveals the sophisticated cruelty that imperial authorities employed to ensure that martyrdom became sufficiently horrific to discourage religious resistance, while providing spectacle that satisfied bloodthirsty crowds who gathered to watch spiritual conviction tested against physical agony. You observe the methodical preparation for Valentine's execution as Roman executioners arrange implements of torture that will transform his death into prolonged public entertainment, rather than quick dispatch of a religious criminal. The process begins with beatings using clubs embedded with metal spikes, designed to create maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious for subsequent tortures that could last hours. Valentine's hands, the same hands that blessed countless secret weddings, are crushed with hammers that shatter bones methodically, finger by finger, while crowds cheer each impact that represents imperial authorities' triumph over a religious rebellion. The torture escalates as executioners employ techniques refined through centuries of Roman experience in breaking human resistance through carefully calibrated pain that pushes victims to the edge of death without allowing the release that unconsciousness or quick demise might provide. Valentine endures procedures that would make modern medical professionals cringe. Heated metal pressed against flesh, joints dislocated systematically, and wounds that are kept fresh and painful through salt applications that prevent healing while maintaining maximum sensitivity to additional torment. A quirky aspect of Valentine's martyrdom emerges from historical accounts suggesting that he performed his final act of romantic defiance while awaiting execution, allegedly healing the blind daughter of his jailer and leaving her a farewell message signed, "From your Valentine," creating the first recorded Valentine that combined love, faith, and impending death in ways that would make modern greeting card writers rather uncomfortable. Apparently, even facing horrific death, our romantic saint couldn't resist one last gesture of affection. though the historical accuracy of this tale remains about as reliable as modern dating apps. You witness the final stages of Valentine's execution as Roman authorities demonstrate their power over both religious conviction and romantic sentiment through public spectacle designed to discourage others from challenging imperial authority through unauthorized marriage ceremonies. The beheading that concludes his martyrdom occurs only after hours of torture that have reduced the priest to barely recognizable humanity, his final moments becoming foundational legend for a holiday that celebrates love while conveniently forgetting the blood that consecrated its origins. The crowd's reaction to Valentine's death reveals medieval understanding that love and violence often intertwine in ways that contemporary romance prefers to ignore or sanitize. Witnesses report that Valentine died praying for his persecutors and blessing the marriages he had performed, creating martyrdom narratives that linked romantic love with spiritual sacrifice in ways that later Christian authorities would find both inspiring and troubling when Valentine's story became associated with February 14th celebrations. Historians still argue whether Valentine's association with romantic love developed immediately after his martyrdom, or emerged centuries later when Christian authorities needed saint stories to overlay pagan fertility festivals. But the connection between love and violent death that characterizes his execution established patterns that would haunt medieval romance for centuries. The blood that marked Valentine's martyrdom became symbolic foundation for a holiday that medieval people understood as celebration of love's dangerous power rather than its gentle comfort. You feel the weight of understanding that the romantic holiday modern people associate with candy and flowers began with brutal execution of a man whose crime was believing that love deserved protection even when authorities declared it dangerous to state security. Valentine's martyrdom created a tradition that medieval people recognized as acknowledgement that true love requires willingness to face death, persecution, and violence rather than expecting comfort and social approval. The legacy of Valentine's bloody execution would influence centuries of medieval romance that understood love as potentially lethal force requiring courage, sacrifice, and acceptance of mortal danger rather than safe emotional experience that contemporary culture promotes through commercial Valentine's Day celebrations that have sanitized away the terror and violence that originally defined February 14th as day when love proved itself through martyrdom. You find yourself in a medieval apothecary's shadowy workshop, surrounded by shelves lined with ceramic jars containing substances that promise romantic success, but deliver death with alarming frequency. The acrid smell of mercury vapour mingles with the sickly sweet scent of belladonna flowers. While your medieval alchemist carefully measures ingredients for love potions that have already claimed more victims than the plague in some unfortunate villages. These aren't the harmless herbal teas that modern wellness enthusiasts might imagine. Medieval love magic employed genuinely lethal substances that desperate romantics consumed with the same enthusiasm that contemporary people approach online dating, though with considerably more permanent consequences. Your apothecary's most popular love potion contains a delightful mixture of powdered human bone, mercury, lead shavings, and various plant alkaloids that attack the nervous system with efficiency that would impress modern poisoners. Medieval people believed that love required suffering to be authentic, so they logically concluded that potions causing physical agony must be particularly effective at generating romantic attraction. The recipe you're observing has been passed down through generations of practitioners who apparently never noticed that their success rate in creating lasting love remained suspiciously low, while their success rate in creating lasting death continued to impress even the most skeptical customers. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval love potions reveals that most romantic remedies contain genuinely toxic substances that medieval people consumed in dangerous quantities. Archaeological analysis of medieval graves shows elevated levels of mercury, arsenic, and plant toxins in remains of individuals who died during traditional courting seasons. Medical texts from the period document symptoms of heavy metal poisoning and alkaloid toxicity that physicians attributed to lovesickness, rather than recognizing that their patients were systematically poisoning themselves in pursuit of romantic success that remained frustratingly elusive despite increasingly desperate chemical interventions. You observe your medieval apothecary preparing his signature irresistible attraction formula, which combines mandrake root, Spanish fly, mercury, and powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, but marketing was apparently just as creative in medieval times as it is today. The mandrake root alone contains tropane alkaloids that cause hallucinations, delirium, and death in doses that medieval romance guides recommended for optimal effectiveness. Spanish fly, despite its romantic reputation, causes kidney failure, digestive hemorrhaging, and extremely painful urination that tends to diminish rather than enhance amorous feelings among surviving users. Your fascination with medieval pharmaceutical romance takes a darker turn as you discover that many love potions were deliberately designed to incapacitate their targets rather than inspire genuine affection, essentially serving as medieval date rape drugs that immobilized victims long enough for unwanted romantic advances. These preparations contained combinations of opium, hemlock, and various fungi that created temporary paralysis while maintaining consciousness, allowing perpetrators to claim that their victims' inability to resist represented proof of irresistible romantic attraction rather than criminal assault facilitated by neurotoxic poisoning. A quirky aspect of medieval love potion culture emerges from the elaborate rituals that practitioners developed for administering toxic romantic remedies, including specific lunar phases, incantations, and preparation methods that often proved more dangerous than the actual ingredients. Some recipes required boiling mercury in wine during thunderstorms, creating vapor concentrations that killed entire households through mercury poisoning, while practitioners believed they were enhancing the potion's romantic effectiveness. Medieval love magic essentially combined chemistry, astronomy, and complete ignorance of basic toxicology into systems that transformed romantic pursuit into accidental homicide with remarkable consistency. You discover that women often served as both primary customers and most frequent victims of medieval love potion culture, purchasing remedies to attract desired partners while becoming targets for men who used similar substances to overcome feminine resistance to unwanted romantic attention. Medieval society essentially created parallel markets for romantic potions. Women bought substances to make themselves more attractive, while men purchased different formulations designed to make women more compliant. The irony that both groups were systematically poisoning themselves and each other in pursuit of love apparently escaped medieval notice, though it probably explains why so many medieval romances ended tragically. The seasonal patterns of love potion deaths reveal that February consistently ranked among the deadliest months for romantic poisoning, as people prepared elaborate chemical courtship strategies for Valentine's Day celebrations that required increasingly exotic and dangerous ingredients. Medieval emergency medical texts include specific sections on treating love potion poisoning during late winter months, suggesting that romantic toxicity became such a predictable annual phenomenon that physicians developed specialized protocols for managing the inevitable casualties that Valentine's Day preparations generated among the chemically adventurous. Your medieval apothecary proudly displays testimonials from satisfied customers, most of whom died within weeks of purchasing his romantic remedies, but whose families attributed their deaths to broken hearts rather than broken liver function. The few survivors often reported hallucinations, personality changes, and various neurological symptoms that practitioners interpreted as evidence of successful romantic transformation rather than recognizing signs of brain damage from heavy metal exposure. Medieval customer service apparently operated on different principles than modern business practices, with product fatality rates serving as marketing tools rather than legal liabilities. The economic impact of medieval love potion culture created entire industries devoted to producing, marketing, and administering romantic remedies that killed customers with remarkable efficiency, while generating enormous profits for practitioners who carefully avoided consuming their own products. Successful love potion merchants often lived in luxury while their clientele died in agony, suggesting that medieval people understood supply and demand economics even when they failed to grasp basic principles of toxicology and human biology. Or historians still argue whether medieval love potion deaths resulted from deliberate poisoning disguised as romantic magic, or genuine accidents caused by ignorance about chemical toxicity. but the consistent patterns of poisoning during courtship seasons suggest that many practitioners understood exactly what their products would accomplish, while marketing them as romantic aids rather than assassination tools. The line between love magic and murder remained conveniently blurred in societies where romantic rivalry often justified lethal intervention. You watch as another hopeful customer purchases a vial of eternal devotion elixir, unaware that eternity might arrive considerably sooner than expected through renal failure rather than romantic fulfillment. Medieval love potions transformed Valentine's Day into annual celebration of chemical warfare disguised as romantic tradition, establishing precedents for dangerous romantic behaviour that would haunt medieval courtship for centuries while providing steady income for apothecaries who understood that desperate love makes for reliable customers, regardless of survival rates. You witness the terror in a young medieval woman's eyes as her father announces her betrothal to a man 3 times her age, whom she's never met. Understanding that resistance to this arrangement could result in violent punishment, complete disinheritance, or exile that would leave her defenceless in a world where unmarried women faced starvation, assault, or forced prostitution. Medieval marriage represented economic and political transaction rather than romantic choice, with love considered dangerous luxury that could undermine carefully negotiated alliances between families whose survival often depended on strategic unions that consolidated land, wealth, and military power. Your presence in this medieval household reveals how Valentine's Day's celebration of romantic love existed in direct opposition to marriage practices that treated affection as potentially destructive force capable of destroying family fortunes and political stability. The arranged marriage negotiations surrounding you demonstrate medieval understanding that romantic feelings between spouses could actually threaten family welfare by encouraging loyalty to personal emotions rather than clan obligations that required marriages to serve broader strategic purposes. Parents who allowed children to marry for love risked economic ruin, military vulnerability, and social disgrace that could affect entire extended families for generations. Medieval society essentially treated romantic love as a form of temporary insanity that required careful management to prevent young people from making emotional decisions that could destroy centuries of careful family planning and alliance building. Your terrified bride-to-be understands that expressing reluctance about her arranged marriage could trigger violent consequences that medieval law explicitly supported as necessary parental discipline for maintaining family honour and economic security. Medieval legal codes permitted fathers to use physical force, imprisonment, and even starvation to compel daughters' compliance with marriage arrangements, while sons who refused strategic marriages faced disinheritance, exile, or forced military service that often proved fatal. Romantic rebellion against arranged marriages represented criminal offence against family authority that justified extreme punitive measures designed to break individual will in favour of collective survival. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval arranged marriages reveals that most unions were negotiated when future spouses were children, often betrothed before age 10 and expected to consummate marriages immediately upon reaching sexual maturity regardless of personal feelings or compatibility. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows dramatically elevated mortality rates among young married women, suggesting that forced early marriages combined with immediate pregnancy expectations created health crises that killed significant percentages of medieval brides before their 20th birthdays. You observe the brutal reality of medieval marriage resistance as families employ techniques that would constitute torture by modern standards to ensure compliance with arranged unions that young people find repugnant or terrifying. Daughters who refuse marriages face imprisonment in convents, where harsh discipline and inadequate nutrition break their resistance, while sons encounter forced military service, arranged accidents, or simple disownment that leaves them vulnerable to violence from creditors who hold family debts. Medieval families essentially operated as totalitarian states, where individual romantic preferences represented treason against collective welfare that required swift and decisive suppression. Your medieval household demonstrates how Valentine's Day romantic ideals created dangerous contradictions in societies where love marriages could trigger blood feuds between families whose carefully planned alliances were disrupted by emotional attachments that ignored economic and political necessities. Young people who heard romantic songs or stories about love matches often developed unrealistic expectations about marriage that led to resistance against arrangements their parents considered essential for family survival. Medieval romantic literature essentially functioned as subversive propaganda that encouraged rebellion against social systems that treated individual emotional satisfaction as luxury that poor families simply couldn't afford. A quirky aspect of medieval marriage coercion emerges from the elaborate psychological warfare that families developed to convince reluctant children that arranged marriages represented romantic destiny rather than economic necessity, including fake love letters, staged romantic encounters, and false stories about prospective spouses' attractions that often proved spectacularly inaccurate when couples finally met. Some families hired professional matchmakers who specialized in romantic manipulation, creating artificial courtship experiences designed to generate emotional attachment to predetermined marriage choices. Medieval parents essentially invented elaborate catfishing schemes that used romantic deception to overcome children's resistance to strategic marriages. You discover that medieval marriage contracts often included specific clauses addressing what would happen if either spouse developed romantic attachments to other people, with penalties ranging from financial forfeiture to physical mutilation designed to discourage extramarital love that could threaten carefully negotiated family alliances. These agreements treated romantic love as a form of breach of contract that justified extreme punishment, including public humiliation, property confiscation, and even execution in cases where adultery threatened important political or economic relationships that marriage was designed to secure and protect. The violence associated with marriage resistance intensified during February, when Valentine's Day celebrations provided dangerous examples of romantic love triumph over family authority, creating seasonal spikes in domestic conflicts as young people exposed to romantic ideals questioned arranged marriages that parents considered essential for family welfare. Medieval emergency medical texts describe specific injuries associated with February marriage resistance, including broken bones, burns, and various wounds that families inflicted to discipline children who developed romantic ideas that threatened strategic marriage plans. Your arranged marriage ceremony proceeds despite the bride's obvious terror and the groom's apparent discomfort, both participants understanding that resistance at this point could trigger violence from families who have invested enormous resources in negotiations that cannot be abandoned without loss of face and financial disaster. Medieval wedding celebrations often resembled hostage exchanges rather than romantic ceremonies, with heavily armed family members ensuring that neither bride nor groom attempted escape during proceedings that legally transferred women from father's property to husband's control. The sexual violence that characterized many medieval arranged marriages received legal protection through marriage laws that defined wives as property whose resistance to unwanted sexual attention constituted theft of services that husbands had legally purchased through dowry payments and family negotiations. Medieval legal codes explicitly stated that wives could not refuse marital sexual demands regardless of personal feelings, making arranged marriages equivalent to legally sanctioned sexual slavery that religious authorities blessed as divinely ordained relationships that served God's plan for human reproduction and social stability. Your observation of medieval marriage politics reveals how Valentine's Day romantic celebrations created cognitive dissonance in societies where love represented luxury that most families couldn't afford without risking economic disaster and social destruction. The holiday essentially celebrated emotional experiences that medieval marriage practices systematically suppressed as dangerous to family welfare, creating annual reminders of freedoms that arranged marriage systems denied to preserve economic and political stability that individual romantic satisfaction could easily undermine. Historians still argue whether medieval arranged marriages actually prevented more violence than they caused, or whether the system created systematic oppression disguised as family protection. But evidence suggests that marriage resistance generated significant domestic violence as families used extreme measures to ensure compliance with economic arrangements that treated individual romantic preferences as threats to collective survival, requiring forceful suppression through whatever means proved effective. You witness the aftermath of successful marriage coercion as newlyweds attempt to build relationships based on fear and resentment rather than mutual attraction, understanding that medieval society expected love to develop after marriage through shared hardship and mutual dependence rather than existing beforehand as foundation for voluntary union. The Valentine's Day that celebrated romantic love existed in parallel universe from medieval marriage reality that treated affection as potential threat to family welfare rather than legitimate basis for lifelong commitment between people who barely knew each other before their wedding ceremonies. You enter the glittering yet dangerous world of medieval courtly love, where romantic devotion transforms into obsessive pursuit that drives knights to commit acts of violence, stalking, and possession that medieval society celebrated as noble romance, rather than recognizing as criminal behavior that terrorized women and destabilized entire kingdoms. The elaborate rituals of courtly love that surround you create artificial romantic relationships where men compete through increasingly dangerous demonstrations of devotion that often result in death, injury, and social chaos as knights attempt to prove their worthiness through feats that prioritize dramatic gesture over genuine affection or respect for their supposed beloved's actual wishes and safety. Your medieval court buzzes with stories of romantic competitors who have died attempting impossible tasks designed to win ladies' favour, including knights who starved themselves to death, threw themselves from castle walls, or embarked on suicidal military campaigns that served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating romantic dedication through self-destruction. Courtly love essentially transformed romantic attraction into elaborate suicide cult, where men proved their devotion through increasingly spectacular acts of self-harm, while women became unwilling prizes in competitions that treated their emotional preferences as irrelevant to male romantic fantasies that prioritized dramatic suffering over mutual affection. The mainstream historical fact governing courtly love reveals that medieval romantic literature celebrated stalking, obsession, and possession as appropriate expressions of male devotion. Legal records from medieval courts document numerous cases of knights who engaged in behaviour that contemporary law would classify as criminal harassment, including following women without permission, breaking into private residences to leave romantic messages, and threatening violence against women who rejected their advances. Medieval society treated these behaviours as the evidence of authentic passion, rather than recognising them as criminal activities that violated women's safety and autonomy. You observe a typical courtly love scenario as a knight spends months lurking around a castle, watching his chosen lady's daily activities without her knowledge or consent, composing elaborate poems about her beauty that describe intimate physical details he could only have obtained through unauthorized surveillance. Medieval romantic literature praised this behaviour as evidence of pure devotion, while the lady in question lives in constant awareness that she's being watched by someone whose romantic obsession could easily transform into violence if she fails to respond appropriately to advances she never invited and cannot safely reject. Your medieval court's Valentine's Day celebrations include tournaments where knights compete in dangerous combat sports designed to win romantic favour through displays of violence that frequently result in permanent injury or death among participants who mistake physical aggression for romantic expression. These events essentially transform courtship into gladiatorial combat, where women become passive spectators to male violence performed in their honour, but without their input about whether they actually enjoy watching men suffer and die for their supposed romantic benefit. Medieval romance apparently confused intimidation with attraction in ways that modern restraining order laws specifically address. Wow. A quirky aspect of courtly love emerges from the elaborate codes of romantic conduct that required knights to suffer visibly for their beloved while maintaining complete secrecy about the relationship, creating impossible contradictions that drove many practitioners into genuine mental illness as they attempted to simultaneously publicise and hide their romantic devotion, Some knights developed elaborate systems of coded communication that allowed them to profess love publicly while maintaining plausible deniability, essentially inventing medieval versions of social media stalking that let them harass women through cryptic messages that couldn't be easily prosecuted under existing legal frameworks. You discover that courtly love competitions often escalated into deadly feuds between romantic rivals who treated women's affections as property that could be won through violence against other suitors, creating cycles of revenge and counter-revenge that devastated noble families, while the women at the centre of these conflicts remained powerless to stop violence committed supposedly in their honour. Medieval courts regularly witnessed duels, assassinations, and small wars that began as romantic rivalry and evolved into generational conflicts that killed dozens of people over women's attention that the original competitors never actually bothered to request or deserve. The psychological impact of courtly love on medieval women reveals the terror of living as unwilling romantic targets for men whose obsessive devotion could easily become violent possession if their advances were rejected, or if they suspected romantic rivals of winning favourable attention. Women learn to carefully manage their public behaviour to avoid encouraging unwanted courtly love, while remaining accessible enough to avoid accusations of pride or cruelty that could justify romantic violence as appropriate punishment for feminine arrogance. Medieval women essentially lived as prisoners of romantic culture that celebrated male obsession while ignoring feminine autonomy. Your court's romantic culture demonstrates how Valentine's Day ideals of passionate love created dangerous precedents for behaviour that medieval law struggled to regulate effectively, since romantic devotion provided legal justification for activities that would otherwise constitute criminal harassment, trespassing, and threats of violence. Knights who claimed to be motivated by pure love could engage in stalking, property destruction, and intimidation with minimal legal consequences, as long as they framed their criminal behaviour as evidence of romantic passion, rather than acknowledging their actions as deliberate attempts to control and possess women through fear. The economic consequences of courtly love include knights who bankrupted themselves financing elaborate romantic gestures designed to impress women whose actual preferences remained unknown because courtly love codes discouraged direct communication in favour of dramatic displays that prioritise male performance over feminine input about desired romantic behaviour. Medieval estate records document numerous cases of noble families who lost lands, titles, and wealth to romantic competitions that consumed resources without generating any practical benefits beyond temporary entertainment value for courts that enjoyed watching men destroy themselves for love. Your observation of courtly love reveals how medieval romantic culture confused intensity with authenticity, treating obsessive behaviour as evidence of genuine affection while discouraging the communication and mutual respect that might actually support healthy romantic relationships. The violence, stalking, and possession that characterise courtly love created romantic precedents that modern domestic violence laws specifically prohibit, suggesting that medieval people systematically mistook abuse for affection in ways that continue influencing contemporary misunderstandings about appropriate romantic behaviour and the difference between love and control. Historians still argue whether courtly love represented genuine romantic innovation that elevated women's status in medieval society, or whether it created elaborate systems of romanticized abuse that gave men social permission to engage in controlling and violent behaviour while claiming to honour feminine virtue. But evidence suggests that courtly love primarily served male psychological needs while creating systematic terror for women who became unwilling participants in romantic fantasies that prioritised dramatic suffering over mutual consent and respect. You witness the tragic conclusion of a typical courtly love affair as competing knights kill each other in a duel over a woman who begged them not to fight, leaving her to live with the knowledge that multiple men died supposedly for her honour while actually satisfying their own need for dramatic romantic gesture that prioritised performance over her explicit wishes for peace. Medieval courtly love transformed Valentine's Day romance into theatre of violence where women served as unwilling props in male fantasies about romantic heroism that confused possession with protection and stalking with devotion. You find yourself in a medieval physician's chamber watching in horror as doctors prepare to treat a young man's dangerous love sickness through medical procedures that would constitute torture by modern standards, including bloodletting that will drain him nearly to death, trepanation to release evil humours from his brain, and forced consumption of mercury-based medicines designed to purge romantic obsession through systematic poisoning. Medieval medical theory classified romantic love as a form of mental illness that required aggressive treatment to prevent emotional attachment from overwhelming rational thought and social responsibility, making Valentine's Day celebrations literally pathological events that threatened public health through contagious romantic madness. Your medieval doctor confidently explains that excessive romantic feeling results from imbalanced bodily humours that create unhealthy heat in the brain, causing victims to lose touch with reality and become dangerously fixated on inappropriate romantic objects who don't return their affection. Medieval medical texts describe love as progressive neurological disease that begins with mild emotional attachment and advances through stages of increasing severity until patients become completely irrational, violent, and potentially homicidal unless medical intervention breaks the romantic obsession through procedures designed to restore proper mental function. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval love medicine reveals that physicians regularly prescribed treatments for romantic attachment that included deliberate starvation, ice baths, physical exhaustion, and herbal preparations containing neurotoxic substances. Medical manuscripts describe love madness as a legitimate psychiatric condition, requiring immediate intervention to prevent romantic feelings from progressing to complete insanity that could make patients dangerous to themselves and others. Archaeological analysis of medieval medical tools reveals specialized instruments designed specifically for treating lovesickness through procedures that modern medicine would recognize as systematic abuse rather than therapeutic intervention. You observe the elaborate diagnostic procedures that medieval physicians developed to identify different stages of romantic illness, including examination of urine colour, pulse patterns, and behavioural symptoms that supposedly revealed the severity of love madness affecting individual patients. Early-stage lovesickness could be treated through dietary modifications and herbal remedies, while advanced cases required increasingly aggressive interventions, including surgical procedures designed to disrupt brain function that physicians believed generated inappropriate romantic attachment to people who couldn't return patients' affections. Your patient writhes in agony as medieval doctors apply heated metal rods to his skull in precise patterns designed to burn away brain tissue responsible for romantic obsession, while assistants hold him down to prevent movement that could interfere with surgical precision required for successful love madness treatment. Medieval physicians believed that romantic feelings originated in specific brain regions that could be destroyed through controlled burning without affecting other mental functions, essentially performing medieval lobotomies that left patients emotionally numb but supposedly cured of dangerous romantic attachment. A quirky aspect of medieval love medicine emerges from the specialized hospitals that some communities established specifically for treating romantic madness, complete with padded cells, restraining devices, and trained staff who understood how to manage patients whose lovesickness made them violent or unpredictable during treatment procedures. These institutions essentially functioned as psychiatric facilities for people whose only crime was experiencing romantic feelings that medieval society considered pathological, suggesting that some communities took love madness so seriously that they developed entire medical infrastructures devoted to curing emotional attachment through systematic brutality. You discover that medieval love medicine included elaborate theories about how romantic feelings spread through communities like contagious diseases, with physicians recommending quarantine procedures to prevent healthy individuals from exposure to love madness that could trigger epidemic romantic outbreaks during Valentine's Day celebrations or other events that encouraged emotional expression. Some medieval medical texts recommend avoiding eye contact with love madness patients, burning their personal belongings, and even relocating entire households to prevent romantic illness from spreading through families or communities. The gender-based differences in medieval love medicine reveal that physicians considered women naturally more susceptible to romantic madness due to their allegedly weaker mental constitution and greater emotional volatility, prescribing different treatments that often proved more violent and invasive than procedures used for male patients. Female love madness supposedly required hysterectomy, forced pregnancy, or exorcism to address romantic obsession that physicians believed originated in women's reproductive systems rather than their brains, making medieval gynecology essentially a branch of psychiatric medicine devoted to controlling feminine emotional expression. Your medieval medical text describes specific pharmaceutical preparations designed to eliminate romantic feelings through chemical modification of brain function, including mercury-based compounds that attack the nervous system, plant extracts containing powerful psychoactive substances, and animal-derived medicines that cause systematic poisoning designed to make patients too sick to maintain emotional attachment to anyone or anything. Medieval love medicine essentially used controlled toxic exposure to break romantic bonds through deliberately induced illness that made affection impossible to sustain. The religious dimensions of medieval love medicine include priests who performed exorcisms to cast out demons that physicians believed caused romantic obsession in patients whose lovesickness resisted conventional medical treatment. Church authorities collaborated with medical practitioners to develop hybrid treatments that combined spiritual intervention with physical torture, designed to break demonic possession that supposedly manifested as inappropriate emotional attachment to romantic objects. Medieval medicine apparently couldn't decide whether love was disease or demonic influence, so they treated it as both simultaneously. Your observation of medieval love treatment reveals how Valentine's Day romantic celebrations directly contradicted medical understanding that the classified emotional attachment as dangerous mental illness requiring immediate professional intervention to prevent romantic feelings from progressing to complete insanity. Medieval physicians essentially declared war on the emotional experiences that Valentine's Day was designed to celebrate, creating systematic conflict between romantic culture and medical authority that left people confused about whether love represented healthy human experience or pathological condition requiring cure. The economic impact of medieval love medicine included specialized medical practices devoted entirely to treating romantic madness, with physicians who developed expertise in lovesickness, commanding premium fees for procedures that promised to cure emotional attachment through systematic destruction of patients' capacity for affection. Medieval families often bankrupted themselves paying for love madness treatment that left their relatives permanently damaged while failing to address underlying emotional needs that romantic attachment was attempting to satisfy. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed that romantic love constituted mental illness, or whether love medicine served as a socially acceptable method for controlling emotional expression that threatened established authority structures. But evidence suggests that medical treatment for love madness consistently resulted in psychological damage that prevented patients from forming healthy relationships while failing to address social conditions that made romantic attachment seem dangerous to medieval authorities. You watch in horror as another love madness patient dies from medical treatment designed to cure romantic feelings through procedures that destroyed his capacity for any emotional experience whatsoever. Understanding that medieval medicine essentially murdered people's ability to love while claiming to protect them from dangerous romantic attachment, the Valentine's Day that celebrated love existed in direct opposition to medical practices that treated affection as illness requiring elimination through whatever means proved necessary to restore patients to emotional numbness that medieval society apparently considered optimal mental health. You step into the shadowy realm of medieval February folklore, where ancient beliefs transform Valentine's Day from innocent romantic celebration into dangerous night when evil spirits feed on human love energy. Supernatural creatures hunt for romantic victims, and the thin boundary between life and death allows malevolent forces to use romantic emotions as pathways for possession and spiritual destruction. Medieval people understood February 14th as liminal time, when the normal protections against supernatural threats weaken. making romantic activities particularly risky because emotional vulnerability creates opportunities for demonic invasion that can destroy souls along with hearts. Your medieval village buzzes with whispered warnings about the supernatural dangers that intensify during February's romantic season, including shape-shifting demons who appear as attractive lovers to lure victims into spiritual traps, vengeful ghosts of people who died from broken hearts seeking living companions to join them in death, and various malevolent entities that feed on romantic energy to gain power over human communities. Medieval folklore treated Valentine's Day as a spiritually hazardous period, requiring special protective rituals and careful avoidance of romantic activities that could attract supernatural attention from creatures who use love as bait for more sinister purposes. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval February superstitions reveals that most European communities developed elaborate protective rituals specifically for Valentine's Day period. Archaeological evidence shows specialized amulets, charms, and ritual objects designed to ward off supernatural romantic predators during mid-February, when folklore claimed that evil spirits became particularly active in targeting couples and individuals engaged in courtship activities. Medieval protective magic during romantic season included iron talismans, blessed herbs, and specific prayers designed to prevent spiritual entities from using romantic emotions as invasion points for demonic possession or supernatural manipulation. You observe the dark rituals that medieval communities performed to protect themselves from supernatural romantic threats, including burning effigies of love demons, creating protective circles around courting couples, and performing exorcisms on anyone who shows signs of supernatural romantic influence during February's dangerous period. Medieval people apparently understood that love made individuals spiritually vulnerable in ways that required community intervention to prevent romantic emotions from becoming pathways for evil forces that could destroy not just individual souls, but entire village populations through spiritual contamination. Your medieval folklore includes terrifying stories about love wraiths, supernatural entities that appear as perfect romantic partners to seduce victims into spiritual bondage that begins with irresistible attraction and ends with complete possession that transforms living people into undead servants of malevolent forces. These creatures supposedly become most active during Valentine's season when heightened romantic emotions create optimal hunting conditions for supernatural predators who use physical beauty and emotional manipulation to trap souls that become permanently enslaved to evil purposes that serve demonic rather than human interests. A quirky aspect of medieval Valentine's folklore emerges from the belief that certain romantic activities during February 14th could accidentally open portals to supernatural realms, allowing evil spirits to enter the physical world through kissing, gift-giving, or romantic declarations that create spiritual resonance between human and demonic dimensions. Some medieval communities banned all romantic activities during February to prevent accidental summoning of love demons who could possess entire villages through romantic energy that served as invitation for supernatural invasion. Apparently, medieval people considered Valentine's Day roughly equivalent to Halloween in terms of supernatural danger, though with significantly more awkward explanations required for why romance might summon demons. You discover that medieval February folklore includes specific warnings about supernatural romantic rivals who compete with human suitors by offering impossible romantic fulfillment that gradually drains victims' life force until they become spiritual vampires serving evil masters who use romantic deception to harvest human souls. These supernatural competitors supposedly appear as ideal romantic partners who fulfill every emotional and physical desire while secretly feeding on their victim's spiritual energy, eventually transforming loving relationships into supernatural parasitism that destroys souls while maintaining the appearance of perfect romance. The temporal aspects of medieval Valentine superstitions include beliefs that romantic activities during specific hours of February 14th could trigger supernatural consequences that affected not just individual couples, but their entire bloodlines for generations, with some romantic choices creating hereditary curses that condemned families to perpetual romantic misfortune through spiritual contamination that passed from parents to children. Medieval people essentially treated Valentine's Day timing as spiritually significant in ways that could affect genetic destiny through supernatural mechanisms that operated according to romantic behaviour during magically dangerous periods. Your medieval community's protective Valentine's rituals include elaborate ceremonies designed to cleanse romantic energy of supernatural contamination before couples engage in courtship activities that could otherwise attract demonic attention or spiritual possession. These purification rites supposedly neutralize evil influences that accumulate around romantic emotions during February's spiritually dangerous period, allowing people to experience love safely without risking their souls to supernatural predators who use Valentine's Day as annual hunting season for human victims whose romantic vulnerability makes them easy targets. The connection between medieval death folklore and Valentine's Day reveals beliefs that people who die during romantic season become supernatural entities bound to earth through unresolved love energy that transforms them into vengeful spirits seeking living companions to join them in undead existence. Medieval cemeteries supposedly become particularly dangerous during February as lovesick ghosts attempt to seduce living people into spiritual unions that result in death or possession rather than romantic fulfillment, making Valentine's Day literally haunted by victims of previous romantic seasons. Your observation of medieval Valentine's protective magic includes specialised blessed objects designed specifically for romantic protection during February's supernatural dangers. Holy water blessed on Valentine's Day supposedly provided stronger protection against love demons than regular religious items, while herbs collected during February's dangerous period gained enhanced power to ward off supernatural romantic threats. Medieval people essentially developed entire magical technologies devoted to making romantic love safe from spiritual predators who treated human emotional vulnerability as opportunity for supernatural exploitation. The agricultural folklore connecting February romance with supernatural plant behaviour includes beliefs that crops planted during Valentine's season would grow into supernatural plants that could entrance humans through magical beauty, while serving as physical anchors for evil spirits seeking permanent residence in human communities. Some medieval farming communities banned agricultural work during February to prevent accidental cultivation of supernatural vegetation that could serve demonic purposes while appearing to provide normal food production. Historians still argue whether medieval Valentine's folklore represented genuine spiritual beliefs or elaborate social control mechanisms designed to regulate romantic behaviour through supernatural fear, but the consistent patterns of protective rituals and supernatural warnings suggest that medieval communities took romantic spiritual dangers seriously enough to develop comprehensive magical systems for managing Valentine's Day as genuinely hazardous period, requiring special precautions to prevent romantic emotions from becoming pathways for spiritual destruction. You feel the weight of medieval understanding that love represents powerful force requiring careful spiritual management to prevent emotional vulnerability from attracting supernatural attention that could destroy souls along with hearts. The Valentine's Day, that modern people experience as harmless romantic celebration, existed for medieval communities as spiritually dangerous period when the normal boundaries between human and supernatural realms weakened enough to allow evil forces to use romantic emotions as invasion points for demonic possession, spiritual vampirism, and supernatural manipulation that could destroy individuals, families, and entire communities through contaminated love energy. You witness the terrifying moment when medieval authorities burst into a cottage where women have gathered to prepare Valentine's Day love charms, their faces illuminating with torchlight as they discover the herbs, candles, and written incantations that will serve as evidence in witchcraft trials that could result in torture, confession, and public execution for the crime of attempting to influence romantic outcomes through supernatural means. Medieval love magic represents one of the most dangerous forms of witchcraft because it directly challenges divine authority over human emotions while providing easy scapegoats for romantic failures, unrequited love, and marital problems that communities prefer to blame on supernatural interference rather than acknowledging natural human relationship difficulties. Your medieval village trembles with fear as witch hunters arrive specifically to investigate Valentine's Day magical practices. understanding that any woman who possesses knowledge of herbs, healing, or traditional romantic remedies could face accusations of demonic collaboration that will result in interrogation techniques designed to extract confessions regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The seasonal timing of these investigations reflects medieval understanding that romantic magic poses particular dangers during February, when heightened emotional energy supposedly makes supernatural intervention more powerful and therefore more threatening to divine order that authorities believe requires protection through violent suppression of unauthorized spiritual practices. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval love magic persecution reveals that witch trials specifically targeting romantic magic resulted in thousands of executions across Europe, with Valentine's Day periods showing statistically significant increases in witchcraft accusations. Court records document systematic persecution of women whose knowledge of traditional romantic practices made them vulnerable to charges of demonic collaboration designed to explain romantic failures and marital discord through supernatural scapegoating rather than addressing social conditions that made healthy relationships difficult to maintain. You observe the methodical investigation of suspected love magic as authorities search for evidence that includes any materials associated with romantic influence, herbs that affect mood or attraction, written love poems that could constitute incantations, personal items from romantic targets that might be used for sympathetic magic, or any knowledge of natural remedies that could be interpreted as supernatural intervention in human romantic relationships. Medieval witch hunters essentially criminalized traditional women's knowledge about human psychology, herbal medicine, and social relationship management by reframing practical skills as demonic supernatural powers. Your suspected witch endures interrogation techniques specifically designed to extract confessions about Valentine's Day magical practices, including sleep deprivation, physical torture, and psychological manipulation that continue until she admits to supernatural romantic interference, whether or not she actually engaged in any magical activities. Medieval legal systems operating under assumption that torture reveals truth create systematic pressure for false confessions that satisfy community needs for supernatural explanations of romantic problems, while providing legal justification for executing women whose traditional knowledge threatens male medical and religious authority. A quirky aspect of medieval love magic prosecution emerges from the elaborate legal distinctions that authorities developed between legitimate romantic assistance and illegal supernatural intervention, with some communities permitting certain traditional practices while criminalizing others according to criteria that often reflected local political conflicts rather than consistent theological principles. Some medieval courts spent considerable time debating whether specific herbs constituted medicine or magic, whether certain romantic rituals represented prayer or witchcraft, and whether traditional matchmaking practices served God or Satan, apparently requiring supernatural legal expertise that most judges lack despite their confidence in prosecuting supernatural crimes. You discover that medieval love magic accusations often served as convenient methods for eliminating women who possessed traditional knowledge that competed with male professional authority, particularly healers, midwives, and herbalists, whose understanding of human psychology and natural remedies threatened the emerging medical and religious institutions that sought to monopolize control over human health and spiritual welfare. Witchcraft trials targeting love magic essentially functioned as professional warfare disguised as spiritual protection, allowing male authorities to eliminate female practitioners while claiming to defend communities against supernatural threats. The social dynamics of love magic persecution reveal how romantic failures could trigger community witch hunts that transformed personal disappointments into public accusations, requiring supernatural explanations for natural human relationship problems. Medieval communities used witchcraft charges to resolve romantic conflicts by identifying magical scapegoats responsible for unrequited love, marital discord, or sexual dysfunction that individuals preferred to blame on supernatural interference rather than accepting personal responsibility for relationship difficulties or acknowledging social conditions that made romantic success challenging to achieve. Your medieval court proceedings demonstrate how authorities used love magic accusations to control female behaviour by criminalising traditional romantic practices that gave women some influence over courtship and marriage outcomes in societies where men otherwise held complete control over romantic relationships. Witchcraft laws targeting love magic essentially outlawed women's attempts to improve their romantic circumstances through traditional knowledge, making female agency in romantic matters evidence of demonic collaboration requiring violent suppression through legal systems designed to protect male dominance in courtship and marriage. The Valentine's Day timing of love magic persecution creates annual cycles of supernatural paranoia that transform romantic celebration into dangerous period when traditional practices become evidence of witchcraft requiring immediate investigation and potential execution. Medieval communities essentially treat February 14th as magical crime season, when normal romantic activities could be interpreted as supernatural intervention requiring violent response from authorities who prefer supernatural explanations for romantic problems over social analysis of conditions that make healthy relationships difficult to maintain. Your observation of torture techniques specifically designed for love magic confession reveals the sadistic creativity that medieval authorities applied to extracting supernatural admissions from women whose traditional romantic knowledge posed threats to male institutional control. Specialized torture devices target reproductive organs, breasts, and other female body parts in procedures designed to demonstrate divine authority over feminine sexuality, while extracting confessions that justify executing women whose practical skills compete with male professional monopolies over healing, spiritual guidance, and human relationship management. The economic aspects of love magic persecution include confiscation of property belonging to accused witches, creating financial incentives for authorities to pursue supernatural charges against women whose wealth or independence makes them attractive targets for legal theft, disguised as spiritual protection. Medieval witch trials targeting love magic often result in property transfers that benefit male authorities while eliminating women whose economic success suggests supernatural assistance that communities choose to criminalise rather than acknowledging female competence in traditional areas of expertise. Historians still argue whether medieval love magic persecution represented genuine spiritual concern about supernatural intervention or systematic oppression designed to eliminate female knowledge and independence through supernatural scapegoating. But the consistent patterns of targeting women with traditional skills during romantic seasons suggest that witchcraft accusations served social control functions that protected male authority while providing convenient explanations for romantic problems that communities preferred to attribute to supernatural interference rather than social analysis. You watch in horror as another suspected love witch burns at the stake while crowds cheer the elimination of supernatural threats to community romantic welfare. Understanding that medieval Valentine's Day celebrations exist in constant tension with authorities who consider romantic magic evidence of demonic collaboration, requiring violent suppression. The love that Valentine's Day supposedly celebrates becomes criminal activity when practiced by women whose traditional knowledge threatens male control over romantic relationships, spiritual authority, and community explanation systems that prefer supernatural scapegoating to social responsibility for creating conditions that support healthy human relationships. You stand in the shadow of medieval tournament grounds watching knights prepare for Valentine's Day combat that will determine romantic hierarchy through violence that frequently results in permanent injury or death among competitors who mistake physical aggression for romantic expression. The clanging of metal on metal echoes across the field as armoured warriors test weapons they'll use to prove romantic worthiness through demonstrations of superior killing ability, while ladies in elevated viewing platforms serve as passive prizes in contests that treat women's affections as trophies to be won through superior violence rather than mutual attraction or emotional compatibility. Your medieval tournament transforms Valentine's Day into organised warfare where romantic rivals settle disputes through judicial combat that legally permits attempted murder as appropriate method for determining which suitor deserves romantic success. with church and secular authorities blessing violence as divinely ordained process for resolving romantic conflicts that ordinary negotiation apparently cannot address effectively. These events essentially function as legal gladiator matches where men prove romantic worthiness by demonstrating superior capacity for inflicting injury on competitors who seek the same woman's attention, making medieval Valentine's Day celebration of love through systematic attempts at homicide. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval romantic violence reveals that tournament combat during Valentine's season resulted in significantly higher mortality rates than regular military contests. Statistical analysis of medieval tournament records shows that February events produced 40% more deaths and permanent injuries than competitions held during other months, suggesting that romantic motivation intensified violent competition beyond normal sporting aggression into genuine attempts to eliminate romantic rivals through legal methods that authorities endorsed as appropriate courtship techniques. You observe the elaborate ritual preparations that transform romantic competition into ritualized warfare, including blessing of weapons by priests who invoke divine assistance for knights seeking to prove romantic worthiness through superior violence, ceremonial dedication of combat to ladies whose romantic favour serves as spiritual justification for attempting to kill other men, and formal oaths that bind competitors to fight without mercy while claiming to serve love, rather than acknowledging their participation in legitimised murder disguised as romantic expression. Your tournament's romantic combat includes specialised weapons designed specifically for romantic violence, including lances decorated with love tokens that competitors hope to drive through rivals' hearts as proof of superior devotion, swords engraved with romantic poems that will taste blood before the day ends, and various customised instruments of war that combine artistic romantic expression with functional capacity for inflicting fatal injuries on men whose only crime involves seeking affection from the same women that other competitors desire. A quirky aspect of medieval romantic violence emerges from the elaborate scoring systems that tournaments developed to determine romantic worthiness through measured application of violence, with points awarded for specific types of injuries inflicted on competitors, style points for particularly creative methods of romantic assault, and bonus recognition for knights who demonstrated superior killing technique while maintaining proper courtly etiquette during attempts to murder their romantic rivals. Medieval romantic competition apparently required sophisticated understanding of both combat tactics and social graces, since killing people impolitely could disqualify otherwise successful romantic warriors. You discover that medieval romantic dueling extended beyond formal tournaments to include private combat that knights arranged to settle romantic disputes through personal violence that often escalated into family feuds lasting generations, as relatives sought revenge for romantic killings that originated in Valentine's Day competitions for women's attention. These private conflicts frequently involved entire noble households in cycles of romantic revenge that killed dozens of people over women's affections that the original competitors never actually bothered to request or deserve through non-violent courtship methods. The legal framework supporting romantic violence includes medieval codes that explicitly permitted trial by combat for romantic disputes, with church authorities blessing violent resolution of love conflicts as appropriate method for determining divine will regarding which suitor deserved romantic success through superior demonstration of warrior capability. Medieval law essentially treated women's romantic preferences as irrelevant to romantic outcomes that should be determined through male violence rather than feminine choice, making legal systems complicit in romantic competitions that prioritize killing ability over emotional compatibility. Your medieval court's Valentine's Day celebrations include formal ceremonies where successful romantic warriors receive symbolic tokens from ladies whose affections have been won through violence, creating ritualized endorsement of romantic success achieved through superior capacity for injuring or killing other men who sought the same women's attention. These ceremonies essentially celebrate romantic outcomes determined through masculine violence while ignoring women's actual preferences about whether they enjoyed watching men suffer and die, supposedly for their romantic benefit. The medical consequences of romantic violence include specialized healers who developed expertise in treating tournament injuries that range from minor wounds to fatal trauma. With Valentine's Day combat producing predictable seasonal increases in demand for emergency medical services that medieval communities learned to anticipate during romantic celebration periods. Medieval emergency medicine essentially operated romantic trauma units designed to manage casualties from legal romantic violence that authorities endorsed as appropriate method for determining courtship outcomes through competitive injury infliction. Your observation of romantic combat reveals how medieval Valentine's Day celebrations confused physical dominance with romantic attractiveness, treating superior violence as evidence of greater love while ignoring the obvious contradiction between claims of romantic devotion and willingness to commit murder over women's attention that competitors never bothered to request through peaceful courtship methods. Medieval romantic culture essentially endorsed sociopathic behaviour as proof of authentic passion, creating precedents for romantic violence that modern domestic abuse laws specifically prohibit. The economic impact of romantic violence includes knights who bankrupted themselves, financing elaborate combat equipment designed to ensure romantic success through superior killing capability, with families investing enormous resources in romantic warfare that often resulted in death or permanent disability, rather than successful courtship outcomes. Medieval romantic competition essentially functioned as a military-industrial complex devoted to producing specialized violence for courtship purposes that consumed wealth without generating practical benefits beyond temporary entertainment for audiences who enjoyed watching men destroy each other for love. The psychological effects of romantic violence on medieval women include living in constant awareness that men's romantic interest could trigger lethal competitions that resulted in multiple deaths over their attention, making feminine beauty potentially deadly liability that attracted unwanted violent attention from men whose romantic devotion expressed itself through willingness to kill other people. Medieval women essentially lived as unwilling prizes in romantic competitions that prioritized male violence over feminine agency, creating systematic terror for women whose attractiveness could trigger homicidal romantic rivalry. Historians still argue whether medieval romantic violence represented aberrant cultural development or logical extension of warrior societies that applied military values to romantic relationships. But evidence suggests that Valentine's Day combat reflected systematic confusion between physical dominance and romantic worthiness that created legal frameworks for romantic terrorism disguised as courtship competition. You watch another romantic duel conclude with fatal results as competitors kill each other over a woman who begged them not to fight. Understanding that medieval Valentine's Day transformed love into excuse for legalized murder that served male psychological needs while terrorizing women who became unwilling focal points for violence that claimed to honor their beauty while completely ignoring their emotional preferences about appropriate romantic behavior. You huddle in secret with underground lovers who risk execution for maintaining Valentine's Day romantic traditions during periods when religious or political authorities have banned love celebrations as threats to public order, divine will, or social stability that require violent suppression through systematic persecution of couples who choose emotional attachment over official policies designed to control human relationships for ideological purposes. These forbidden romantic gatherings operate like resistance movements in societies where love becomes political crime requiring careful coordination, coded communication, and constant vigilance against authorities who consider romantic expression evidence of subversion that justifies imprisonment, torture, or execution. Or your clandestine Valentine's celebration takes place in hidden cellars, abandoned buildings, or remote forest clearings where couples gather to exchange forbidden romantic tokens, perform banned love rituals, and maintain emotional connections that authorities consider dangerous to social order that depends on preventing romantic attachments that could undermine loyalty to state, church, or family systems that demand complete obedience over personal emotional satisfaction. Medieval underground romance requires sophisticated operational security that rivals political resistance movements, since discovery could result in punishments that range from public humiliation to death depending on local policies regarding romantic subversion. The mainstream historical fact governing underground romantic resistance reveals that numerous medieval societies banned Valentine's Day celebrations during political or religious crises, with documented enforcement campaigns that resulted in hundreds of executions for the crime of romantic expression. Court records show systematic persecution of couples who maintained love traditions during periods when authorities considered emotional attachment incompatible with social policies requiring absolute dedication to state, religious or military purposes that romantic relationships supposedly undermined through divided loyalty. You observe the elaborate security measures that underground romantic communities develop to protect Valentine's Day celebrations from authorities who treat love as criminal conspiracy requiring infiltration, surveillance, and violent suppression through specialized enforcement units trained to identify and eliminate romantic resistance. These protective systems include lookouts posted to warn of approaching authorities, escape routes planned for emergency evacuation during raids, and communication networks that use coded language to coordinate romantic activities without revealing operational details that could compromise entire underground networks devoted to preserving love during politically dangerous periods. Your forbidden Valentine's gathering includes couples who have been separated by authorities but maintain relationships through secret meetings that could result in death if discovered, demonstrating the lengths to which people will go to preserve emotional connections that political systems consider threats to social control, requiring elimination through whatever means prove necessary. Underground romantic resistance essentially proves that human need for emotional attachment exceeds fear of violent punishment, creating persistent challenges for authorities who discover that banning love generates more romantic energy than permitting normal courtship activities. A quirky aspect of medieval underground romance emerges from the elaborate codes and symbols that forbidden lovers developed to communicate romantic messages without attracting official attention, including secret languages, hidden meeting places, and complex signalling systems that allow romantic coordination while maintaining plausible deniability about subversive emotional activities. Some underground romantic networks develop communication sophistication that rivals military intelligence operations, apparently requiring advanced cryptographic skills to maintain love relationships during politically repressive periods. Medieval romance apparently produced surprisingly competent spies, though their primary mission involved coordinating dates rather than stealing state secrets. You discover that underground Valentine's communities often develop alternative romantic cultures that emphasize spiritual and emotional connection over physical expression, since authorities typically focus surveillance on obvious romantic behaviors while missing subtle emotional bonds that sustain couples through periods of forced separation and constant danger. These alternative romantic practices include meditation techniques for maintaining emotional connection across distance, spiritual rituals that strengthen romantic bonds without physical contact, and psychological support systems that help couples endure romantic persecution without abandoning relationships that authorities want to destroy. The network structure of underground romance includes safe houses where forbidden couples can meet temporarily, sympathetic clergy who perform secret romantic ceremonies despite official religious opposition, and community support systems that provide material assistance to romantic fugitives whose relationships have made them enemies of state or religious authorities. Medieval underground romance essentially operates parallel social infrastructure devoted to preserving human emotional needs during periods when official society attempts to eliminate romantic attachment through systematic violence and legal persecution. Your participation in Forbidden Valentine's rituals reveals how romantic resistance develops unique cultural traditions that combine traditional love customs with revolutionary elements that explicitly challenge authority systems attempting to control human emotional expression. Underground romantic communities create new holidays, develop alternative marriage ceremonies, and establish romantic practices that serve as acts of political defiance while maintaining emotional authenticity that official romantic systems often lack due to their focus on social control rather than genuine human connection. The psychological impact of romantic persecution includes couples who develop intensified emotional bonds through shared danger and mutual support, during periods when their love faces systematic elimination from authorities who consider emotional attachment evidence of moral corruption or political disloyalty. Forbidden romance often produces stronger relationships than socially approved courtship, because shared persecution creates emotional intimacy and mutual dependence that comfortable social acceptance rarely generates, making underground love paradoxically more satisfying than official romantic options. Your observation of secret Valentine's ceremonies includes modified traditional practices adapted for security requirements that prevent detection while maintaining romantic authenticity that sustains couples through persecution designed to break emotional bonds through fear, separation, and violence. Underground romantic culture essentially proves human creativity in preserving essential emotional experiences despite systematic attempts to eliminate love through political and religious oppression that underestimates human determination to maintain relationships that provide meaning and satisfaction. The seasonal patterns of romantic persecution include intensified enforcement during February, when authorities anticipate increased underground Valentine's activity, creating annual cycles of romantic resistance and official violence that transform love celebrations into political battlegrounds where human emotional needs conflict with institutional control systems. Medieval underground romance essentially operates according to seasonal rebellion patterns that require careful planning and community coordination to protect romantic activities from predictable enforcement campaigns. The generational aspects of underground romance include families who maintain forbidden romantic traditions across multiple generations despite persistent persecution, creating hereditary romantic resistance that passes secret knowledge about love practices through family networks that authorities struggle to penetrate effectively. Some underground romantic communities preserve banned traditions for centuries, apparently developing cultural immunity to official attempts at emotional control through institutional persistence that outlast individual persecution campaigns. Historians still argue whether underground romantic resistance represented genuine political opposition or simple human stubbornness about maintaining emotional traditions during periods of social upheaval. But evidence suggests that forbidden love movements often developed sophisticated organizational capabilities that challenged authority systems beyond their specific romantic focus, making romantic persecution potentially counterproductive for governments seeking social control through emotional suppression. You feel the dangerous thrill of forbidden love as your secret Valentine's celebration concludes without detection. Understanding that medieval underground romance proves human willingness to risk death for emotional connection that authorities consider threatening to social order. The love that drives romantic resistance demonstrates power that political and religious systems struggle to control effectively, making Valentine's Day literally a revolutionary celebration of human emotional autonomy against institutional attempts to eliminate personal attachment in favour of absolute loyalty to abstract authority systems that cannot satisfy basic human needs for connection and affection. You experience Valentine's Day during medieval plague years when romantic celebration becomes grotesque. Dance with death as lovers exchange gifts while corpses pile in streets. When courtship takes place in cemeteries because those are the only spaces not contaminated by diseased bodies. And when romantic poetry focuses on death rather than passion, because survival past next week seems more romantic than promises of eternal devotion. Medieval plague transforms Valentine's Day into a morbid festival where love and mortality intertwine so completely that romantic success means finding someone willing to die alongside you, rather than seeking partners for long-term happiness that epidemic conditions make impossible to achieve or maintain. Your plague-stricken medieval city transforms February 14th into Memorial Day for romantic relationships that disease has destroyed through death, separation, and the constant terror that physical contact with beloved partners could result in mutual infection and agonizing death within days of romantic intimacy. Valentine's Day celebrations during plague years include visiting graves of romantic partners who died from disease, writing love letters to deceased spouses or lovers, and performing memorial rituals that honour romantic connections severed by epidemic mortality rather than failed relationships or personal choice. The mainstream historical fact governing Plague-era romance reveals that medieval epidemics fundamentally altered courtship practices and romantic expectations. Historical records show dramatic decreases in traditional Valentine's Day activities during plague years, with surviving celebrations focusing on memorial observances for dead lovers rather than courtship activities aimed at attracting new romantic partners who could easily die before relationships developed beyond initial attraction. Archaeological evidence from plague cemeteries shows romantic tokens buried with victims, suggesting that Valentine's Day gifts often became funeral offerings within weeks of exchange. You observe how plague conditions create romantic urgency that transforms Valentine's Day courtship into desperate attempts to experience love before inevitable death, with couples rushing into intimate relationships that would normally develop over months or years because epidemic mortality makes future planning irrelevant compared to immediate emotional fulfillment. Plague-era romance essentially operates according to wartime psychology, where traditional romantic timing becomes luxury that survival conditions cannot support, creating intense but brief relationships that prioritize immediate connection over long-term compatibility. Your Plague Valentine's celebration includes romantic activities specifically adapted for epidemic conditions, such as exchanging love tokens through intermediaries to avoid direct contact that could spread disease, writing romantic messages on walls of abandoned buildings where lovers can read them without meeting face to face, and developing hand signals or visual codes that allow romantic communication while maintaining safe distances that prevent infection transmission. Medieval plague romance essentially invents early social distancing protocols for maintaining emotional connection despite health conditions that make physical proximity potentially lethal. A quirky aspect of Plague-era Valentine's Day emerges from the dark humour that medieval people develop about romantic relationships during epidemic conditions, including jokes about courtship that leads directly to burial, romantic poetry that rhymes love with grave, and wedding ceremonies that double as funeral preparations, since marriage during plague years often results in widowhood within weeks. Some medieval plague communities develop sardonic Valentine's traditions that explicitly acknowledge epidemic mortality through romantic celebrations that mock death while expressing genuine affection for partners who will probably die soon. Medieval people apparently developed quite sophisticated gallows humour about romance during literally gallows-appropriate circumstances. You discover that Plague-era romantic gift-giving includes practical items designed for epidemic survival rather than traditional romantic tokens, with lovers exchanging protective amulets, herbal remedies, and medical supplies that demonstrate caring through attempts to preserve partners' lives, rather than expressing affection through decorative items that serve no survival function. These practical Valentine's gifts include specialized masks designed to filter infected air, blessed herbs that supposedly prevent disease transmission, and written medical advice that could help partners survive plague conditions that kill most people regardless of romantic devotion. The religious dimensions of Plague Valentine's Day include modified romantic prayers that focus on divine protection against disease rather than traditional requests for successful courtship. With couples seeking spiritual intervention to prevent epidemic death from destroying romantic relationships before they can develop into lasting partnerships. Medieval plague romance essentially becomes a form of religious devotion where romantic survival requires divine assistance that traditional courtship prayers cannot address adequately, making a Valentine's Day celebration blend romantic and spiritual desperation. Your participation in Plague-era Valentine's rituals reveals how epidemic conditions transform romantic priorities from attraction and compatibility toward basic survival and mutual protection, with successful relationships defined by partners' ability to keep each other alive rather than traditional romantic satisfaction or emotional fulfillment. Plague romance essentially reduces love to fundamental survival partnership, where romantic success means avoiding death long enough to experience genuine emotional connection before epidemic conditions eliminate one or both partners. The community aspects of Plague Valentine's Day include collective memorial services for romantic relationships that disease has destroyed, with surviving community members honouring deceased couples through ceremonies that celebrate love while acknowledging epidemic mortality that makes romantic survival exceptional rather than expected outcome. These community plague memorials essentially transform Valentine's Day from individual romantic celebration into collective mourning ritual that recognises love's fragility during conditions when human mortality reaches crisis levels. Your observation of plague romantic behaviour reveals how epidemic conditions intensify emotional connections through shared survival experiences that create intimacy more quickly than normal courtship processes, with couples who survive plague together often developing stronger relationships than those formed under comfortable social conditions. Plague romance essentially proves that shared danger and mutual protection can generate more authentic emotional bonds than traditional romantic activities that lack survival significance, making epidemic Valentine's Day paradoxically more romantically successful than peaceful celebrations. The psychological effects of plague-era romance include survivors who develop permanent trauma from watching romantic partners die from disease, creating post-plague Valentine's Day observances that honour lost love while struggling with survivor guilt and fear of forming new romantic attachments that could result in similar loss. Medieval plague survivors often maintain memorial Valentine's traditions for decades after epidemics end, suggesting that romantic relationships formed during epidemic conditions create emotional bonds that persist despite death and separation. The economic aspects of plague Valentine's Day include collapsed traditional romantic commerce, as businesses that serve normal courtship activities close due to epidemic conditions. While new economic opportunities emerge around survival-focused romantic services, including protective equipment for couples, medical supplies for romantic partnerships, and specialised burial services for romantic relationships ended by disease rather than choice, historians still argue whether plague-era romantic behaviour represented authentic emotional response to epidemic conditions or psychological denial of mortality that used romantic activity to avoid confronting an inevitable death. But evidence suggests that plague Valentine's Day celebrations provided genuine emotional comfort during circumstances that made normal romantic expression impossible, while creating intense need for human connection despite dangerous physical proximity. You understand that medieval plague transforms Valentine's Day from celebration of romantic possibility into memorial for love's fragility, creating Valentine's traditions that acknowledge death as romance's constant companion rather than distant threat. Plague-era lovers essentially practice romantic philosophy that modern people struggle to understand, that love means accepting mortality while choosing emotional connection despite inevitable loss, making Valentine's Day celebration of courage rather than comfort, devotion despite death rather than dreams of eternal happiness. You witness the brutal aftermath of a broken medieval engagement as the spurned suitor's family arrives at dawn with armed retainers, prepared to collect the painful consequences that society demands when romantic contracts are violated, including financial compensation that could bankrupt entire families, physical punishment that might include public flogging or mutilation, and honour-based violence that transforms failed romantic relationships into blood feuds lasting generations. Medieval engagement agreements function as binding legal contracts whose violation triggers systematic retaliation, designed to restore family honour while punishing romantic betrayal through public demonstrations of consequences that await anyone who treats romantic commitment as casual emotional decision rather than serious legal obligation. Your medieval betrothal contract includes specific penalty clauses that detail precisely what punishments await either party who attempts to break romantic agreements that families have negotiated as business partnerships rather than emotional relationships, with financial forfeitures that could include entire dowries, land holdings, and accumulated family wealth transferred to injured parties whose romantic expectations have been violated through contractual breach. These agreements essentially treat romantic commitment as commercial transaction, whose violation requires compensation calculated according to economic damage rather than emotional injury, making failed engagements potential financial disasters that affect entire extended families. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval marriage contracts reveals that broken engagements regularly resulted in violence, legal warfare, and systematic family destruction. Court records document hundreds of cases where failed romantic agreements triggered conflicts that included armed raids, property destruction, kidnapping, and murder as families sought compensation for romantic betrayal that damaged their economic interests and social reputation. Medieval legal systems explicitly supported violent retaliation for broken engagement contracts, making a romantic commitment legally equivalent to business partnerships whose violation justified extreme punitive measures. You observe the methodical collection of engagement penalties as creditors arrive to seize property, livestock, and personal belongings that serve as compensation for romantic betrayal, while family members who guaranteed the engagement face personal liability that could include debt slavery, forced military service, or physical punishment designed to satisfy honour requirements that romantic violation has triggered. Medieval engagement enforcement essentially operates according to organised crime collection methods, with systematic intimidation and violence, ensuring that romantic contracts receive priority over other legal obligations through fear-based compliance systems. Your broken engagement triggers honour-based violence as male family members from both sides engage in armed conflict designed to restore reputations that romantic betrayal has damaged, with duels, raids, and small wars developing from romantic disputes that escalate beyond personal disagreement into generational feuds requiring blood payment for honour violations that romantic failure has created. Medieval honour culture essentially treats broken romantic promises as acts of war that require violent response to maintain family credibility and social standing that romantic betrayal threatens through public humiliation. A quirky aspect of medieval engagement enforcement emerges from the specialised legal professionals who develop expertise in romantic contract violations, including debt collectors who specialise in engagement penalties, honour-based violence coordinators who arrange appropriate retaliation for romantic betrayal, and family reputation managers who develop strategies for minimising social damage from broken romantic agreements. Some medieval communities apparently require romantic contract specialists to navigate the complex legal and violent consequences that engagement violation could trigger, suggesting that medieval romance law required professional expertise that most families couldn't provide independently. You discover that broken engagement consequences often extend beyond immediate families to affect entire communities, as romantic contract violations trigger economic disruptions, social conflicts, and violent feuds that can divide villages and destroy regional stability through romantic disagreements that escalate into broader political conflicts. Medieval engagement agreements essentially function as international treaties whose violation can destabilize entire social networks through romantic betrayal that affects marriage alliances, economic partnerships, and political relationships that depend on romantic contracts for community peace and prosperity. The gender-based differences in engagement penalty enforcement reveal that women who break romantic contracts face different but equally severe consequences compared to male contract violators, including forced religious confinement, arranged punishment marriages, or systematic social ostracism designed to destroy their future romantic prospects while serving as warnings to other women about consequences of romantic betrayal. Medieval engagement law essentially operates according to gender-specific punishment systems that ensure both men and women face severe consequences for romantic contract violation while maintaining social control over courtship behaviour. Your medieval community's enforcement of engagement penalties includes public humiliation rituals designed to shame contract violators while deterring future romantic betrayal through demonstrations of social consequences that await people who treat romantic commitment casually rather than honouring family obligations that engagement agreements represent. These public shaming ceremonies include forced confessions of romantic betrayal, symbolic punishments that mark violators for community recognition, and social exclusion that prevents future romantic opportunities for people whose past contract violations make them unreliable romantic partners. The religious dimensions of engagement enforcement include church authorities who develop specialised procedures for handling broken romantic contracts, with ecclesiastical courts that impose spiritual penalties for romantic betrayal, while coordinating with secular authorities to ensure that contract violators face both legal and religious consequences for failing to honour romantic commitments that church blessing has sanctified as spiritually binding obligations, requiring divine and human enforcement. Your observation of engagement contract enforcement reveals how medieval society treats romantic relationships as too important for individual emotional control, requiring community intervention to ensure that personal romantic decisions serve broader social purposes rather than individual satisfaction that could undermine family welfare and community stability. Medieval engagement enforcement essentially prioritises collective social needs over individual romantic autonomy, making personal emotional preferences subordinate to community requirements for stable romantic contracts that support economic and political systems. The long-term consequences of broken engagements include families who maintain grudges for generations over romantic betrayals that occurred decades earlier, creating hereditary conflicts that pass romantic grievances from parents to children through family honour systems that require ongoing retaliation for past romantic injuries. Medieval romantic contract violations essentially create permanent social damage that affects family relationships and community stability long after original romantic disagreements have been forgotten by everyone except those responsible for maintaining honour-based revenge systems. The economic specialisation around engagement enforcement includes professional debt collectors, honour-based violence specialists, and romantic contract mediators who develop careers managing the complex consequences that broken engagements create for medieval communities, struggling to balance individual romantic preferences against collective social stability requirements. Medieval romance apparently generated sufficient contractual complexity to support specialised legal professions devoted to managing romantic business relationships. Historians still argue whether medieval engagement penalty systems represented necessary social protection against romantic chaos, or systematic oppression designed to control individual emotional autonomy through threat of violent retaliation. But evidence suggests that romantic contract enforcement served community stability functions while creating systematic terror for individuals whose emotional preferences conflicted with family obligations and social expectations that prioritise collective welfare over personal romantic satisfaction. You feel the weight of understanding that medieval romantic relationships operate according to legal and violent enforcement systems that make personal emotional preferences potentially dangerous luxuries that could trigger systematic retaliation affecting entire families and communities. Medieval Valentine's Day exists within social systems that treat romantic love as collective responsibility, requiring community control rather than individual freedom. Making a romantic choice potentially lethal decision that affects far more people than contemporary romantic relationships, typically involved through social systems that prioritise stability over emotional autonomy. You immerse yourself in the disturbing world of medieval romantic literature, where the most celebrated love stories feature stalking, kidnapping, forced marriage, and emotional manipulation presented as idealised romantic behaviour that audiences applaud rather than recognising as criminal activity that would result in restraining orders and imprisonment under contemporary legal systems. These dark romantic tales shape medieval Valentine's Day expectations by promoting relationship models where women serve as prizes to be won through persistence that ignores consent, where male obsession represents proof of authentic love, and where resistance to unwanted romantic attention demonstrates feminine virtue that requires patient male conquest rather than respectful acceptance of rejection. Kura. Your medieval romantic manuscript collection includes stories that celebrate heroes who follow women without permission, break into their homes to leave romantic messages, and threaten violence against romantic rivals, while claiming these behaviours prove irresistible devotion rather than acknowledging them as systematic harassment campaigns designed to overcome feminine resistance through intimidation and emotional manipulation. Medieval romance literature essentially provides instruction manuals for stalking the behaviour disguised as romantic inspiration. teaching audiences that persistence overcomes consent and that women's stated preferences represent obstacles to be defeated, rather than boundaries requiring respect. The mainstream historical fact governing medieval romantic literature reveals that the most popular love stories consistently portrayed relationship dynamics that contemporary law recognizes as domestic abuse. Literary analysis of medieval romances shows systematic celebration of possessive behavior, emotional manipulation, and threats of violence as evidence of authentic masculine love. While feminine resistance to unwanted attention receives narrative punishment until women accept romantic pursuit they initially rejected, medieval audiences apparently preferred romantic stories that validated controlling behavior over narratives that emphasized mutual respect and consensual relationships. You discover that medieval Valentine's Day celebrations often include public readings of romantic literature that reinforces dangerous relationship models, with audiences cheering for male protagonists who overcome feminine resistance through persistence that ignores explicit rejection, while treating women's eventual submission as proof that patient pursuit overcomes initial reluctance that represents testing rather than genuine refusal. These literary celebrations essentially provide community endorsement for romantic behavior that modern domestic violence prevention specifically identifies as warning signs of abusive relationships. Your medieval romantic poetry celebrates male emotional suffering as proof of authentic love, while completely ignoring feminine emotional experience, except as motivation for male romantic behavior, creating literary models where women exist primarily as inspiration for masculine romantic performance rather than being recognized as independent individuals whose emotional needs and preferences matter equally to male romantic satisfaction. Medieval romantic literature essentially treats women as romantic objects rather than emotional subjects, providing literary precedent for relationships based on male fantasy rather than mutual emotional connection. A quirky aspect of medieval romantic literature emerges from the elaborate psychological manipulation techniques that romantic heroes employ to overcome feminine resistance, including fake illnesses designed to generate sympathy, stage rescues from the dangers that heroes have secretly arranged, and various deception strategies that manipulate women's emotions while claiming to demonstrate authentic romantic devotion. Some medieval romantic stories essentially read like instruction manuals for emotional manipulation, apparently teaching audiences that successful romance requires sophisticated deception rather than honest communication about mutual attraction and compatibility. You observe how medieval romantic literature normalizes relationship escalation that progresses from unwanted attention to systematic harassment to eventual possession regardless of feminine consent, with narrative structures that reward male persistence while punishing feminine autonomy through plot developments that demonstrate negative consequences for women who maintain romantic independence. These stories essentially argue that women who resist male romantic attention will suffer until they accept masculine pursuit, creating literary propaganda for relationship models based on coercion rather than mutual choice. The religious elements in medieval romantic literature include divine intervention that supports male romantic pursuit while punishing feminine resistance, with God apparently endorsing masculine romantic persistence while opposing women's attempts to maintain emotional autonomy through supernatural plot devices that force romantic outcomes regardless of individual preference. Medieval religious romance essentially claims divine authorization for controlling romantic behavior, while suggesting that feminine resistance to male pursuit represents spiritual rebellion requiring supernatural correction. Your collection of medieval romantic literature includes disturbing celebration of age-inappropriate relationships, where adult men pursue significantly younger women or girls whose lack of life experience makes them vulnerable to manipulation that literature presents as romantic rather than predatory behavior. These narratives normalize relationship power imbalances while celebrating masculine romantic success, achieved through targeting vulnerable individuals who lack resources to resist unwanted attention effectively, creating literary models that validate exploitation disguised as romantic devotion. The social impact of medieval romantic literature includes audiences who model their real-world romantic behaviour on literary examples that celebrate harassment and manipulation as proof of authentic love, creating communities where stalking receives social approval while feminine resistance to unwanted attention triggers criticism for failing to appreciate masculine romantic devotion. Medieval romantic education essentially trains people to mistake abuse for affection while teaching audiences that healthy romantic relationships require feminine submission to masculine persistence, regardless of personal preference. Your analysis of medieval romantic narrative structures reveals consistent patterns where women's initial rejection of male romantic attention serves as narrative obstacle to be overcome rather than legitimate boundary requiring respect, with plot developments that systematically break down feminine resistance through escalating male romantic pressure that literature presents as evidence of devotion rather than acknowledging a systematic campaign to overcome consent through persistence and manipulation. The Valentine's Day connection to medieval romantic literature includes seasonal increases in demand for romantic stories that reinforce dangerous relationship models during periods when people seek romantic inspiration from literary sources that celebrate controlling behaviour while providing community validation for romantic approaches that prioritise male satisfaction over feminine autonomy and emotional safety. The psychological effects of medieval romantic literature on contemporary readers include normalisation of possessive romantic behaviour and systematic misunderstanding of healthy relationship dynamics, with audiences learning to interpret controlling behaviour as evidence of passionate love, while failing to recognise genuine romantic respect and mutual emotional consideration that healthy relationships require for long-term satisfaction and individual well-being. Historians still argue whether medieval romantic literature accurately reflected contemporary relationship practices or created idealised fantasy that audiences understood as fictional rather than realistic romantic guidance. But evidence suggests that romantic literature significantly influenced real-world courtship behaviour by providing social validation for controlling romantic approaches while teaching audiences to mistake manipulation for devotion and persistence for authentic emotional connection. You close your medieval romantic manuscript understanding that these dark love stories continue influencing contemporary Valentine's Day expectations through cultural transmission that preserves dangerous romantic models disguised as traditional romantic wisdom. Medieval romantic literature essentially created romantic mythology that celebrates emotional manipulation while teaching generations of readers to mistake controlling behaviour for passionate love, making these ancient stories surprisingly relevant to modern discussions about healthy romantic relationships and the cultural sources of contemporary relationship problems. You stand among the jeering crowd in a medieval town square as authorities prepare to execute a condemned prisoner on February 14th, understanding that this timing represents deliberate political messaging about the dangers of inappropriate love rather than coincidental scheduling. With public officials using Valentine's Day executions to demonstrate state power over romantic relationships that threaten social order through unauthorised emotional attachments that challenge official control over human sexuality and marriage. Medieval Valentine's Day becomes annual theatre of violence, where romantic transgression receives ultimate punishment through carefully scheduled public death that serves as community education about consequences awaiting those who pursue forbidden love. Your medieval execution serves multiple propaganda purposes as authorities demonstrate that romantic love cannot protect individuals from state power that reserves the right to kill anyone whose emotional attachments conflict with official policies regarding appropriate sexual behaviour, marriage arrangements, or social relationships that serve state interests rather than individual emotional satisfaction. The Valentine's Day timing transforms routine capital punishment into symbolic demonstration that love represents luxury that political authority can eliminate through violence whenever romantic relationships threaten systems that prioritise social control over personal emotional autonomy. The mainstream historical fact governing Valentine's Day executions reveals that medieval authorities regularly scheduled capital punishment during romantic seasons to maximise political impact. court records show statistically significant increases in executions during February, with many death sentences deliberately timed to coincide with Valentine's Day celebrations as method of discouraging romantic behaviour that authorities considered dangerous to public order. Archaeological evidence from medieval execution sites shows Valentine's Day death dates carved into memorial stones, suggesting that romantic timing of executions became sufficiently common to warrant specific historical documentation. You observe the elaborate ceremony surrounding Valentine's Day executions as authorities transform capital punishment into religious and political theatre that combines entertainment, education, and intimidation through public spectacle designed to demonstrate divine and royal authority over human life, while warning audiences about consequences of romantic behaviour that challenges official policies regarding appropriate emotional expression and sexual conduct. These ceremonial executions essentially function as community festivals, where death serves as entertainment while reinforcing social control through demonstration of ultimate consequences for romantic transgression. Your condemned prisoner faces execution for crimes that specifically involve unauthorized romantic activity, including adultery with socially inappropriate partners, marriage outside approved social classes, or romantic relationships that violate religious law regarding sexual conduct that authorities consider threatening to community moral standards. Valentine's Day executions essentially criminalize emotional attachment when romantic relationships conflict with official policies that prioritize social stability over individual emotional satisfaction, making love literally deadly when it challenges established authority systems. A quirky aspect of medieval Valentine's executions emerges from the elaborate last words and final statements that condemned prisoners used to deliver romantic messages while facing death, including love letters read aloud before execution, romantic poems recited during final moments, and declarations of eternal devotion that transform political execution into romantic martyrdom that authorities struggle to prevent despite careful control over execution procedures. Some condemned lovers apparently managed to convert their executions into romantic advertising that promoted dangerous love rather than deterring it, suggesting that martyrdom created romantic inspiration rather than serving as effective deterrent against forbidden emotional attachments. You discover that Valentine's Day executions often target couples simultaneously, with authorities scheduling coordinated deaths for romantic partners whose unauthorized relationships require elimination through synchronized capital punishment that demonstrates state power over emotional bonds that individuals consider private, but that political systems treat as public concern requiring violent intervention. These coordinated executions essentially function as anti-wedding ceremonies where state authority replaces religious blessing, while death substitutes for matrimonial union in demonstrations of political power over romantic relationships. The crowd's reaction to Valentine's Day executions reveals community attitudes toward romantic transgression that range from sympathetic support for romantic martyrs to enthusiastic approval of state violence against unauthorized love, with audience responses reflecting social divisions about whether romantic freedom deserves protection or represents dangerous luxury requiring elimination through whatever violence proves necessary for maintaining official control over human emotional expression and sexual behavior. Your medieval execution protocol includes specialized procedures for romantic criminals whose deaths require additional symbolic elements designed to reinforce official messages about dangerous love, including destruction of romantic tokens and love letters in execution fires, public reading of charges that detail specific romantic crimes, and ceremonial elements that demonstrate triumph of state authority over individual emotional autonomy that romantic relationships represent when they conflict with political requirements for absolute loyalty. The religious dimensions of Valentine's Day executions include church authorities who provide spiritual justification for killing romantic criminals through theological arguments that present unauthorized love as spiritual rebellion requiring death penalty to protect community moral standards from contamination by inappropriate emotional attachments. Religious execution ceremonies essentially claim divine authorization for political violence while presenting romantic freedom as satanic influence that requires elimination through holy war against dangerous emotional autonomy. Your observation of execution aftermath reveals how Valentine's Day deaths become martyrdom stories that inspire additional romantic rebellion rather than deterring unauthorized love, with execution sites becoming pilgrimage destinations for lovers who seek inspiration from romantic martyrs whose deaths demonstrate that love transcends political authority despite violent consequences. Medieval romantic martyrdom essentially creates religious cults devoted to celebrating dangerous love while challenging authority systems that attempt to control human emotional expression through capital punishment. The economic aspects of Valentine's Day executions include specialized markets that develop around execution events, with vendors selling food, entertainment, and romantic tokens to crowds who attend public deaths as seasonal festivals that combine entertainment value with educational messaging about consequences of unauthorized romantic behavior. Medieval execution tourism essentially converts capital punishment into economic opportunity, while creating commercial incentives for authorities to maintain regular execution schedules during romantic seasons. The legal precedents established through Valentine's Day executions include judicial principles that explicitly authorize capital punishment for romantic crimes that authorities consider dangerous to social stability, creating legal frameworks that treat emotional attachment as potentially treasonous activity, requiring violent suppression when romantic relationships conflict with official policies regarding appropriate sexual conduct and marriage arrangements. Historians still argue whether Valentine's Day executions represented systematic political oppression designed to control human sexuality or legitimate responses to romantic behavior that genuinely threatened medieval social stability. But evidence suggests that romantic executions served social control functions while creating martyrdom narratives that inspired romantic resistance rather than eliminating unauthorized love through intimidation and violence. You witness the final moments of Valentine's Day execution as romantic martyrs die while declaring eternal love that transcends political authority. Understanding that medieval states attempt to control human emotional expression through ultimate violence, while inadvertently creating romantic inspiration that challenges official authority through demonstration that love can survive even capital punishment designed to eliminate unauthorized emotional attachments. The legacy of Valentine's Day executions includes romantic martyrdom traditions that celebrate love's triumph over political violence, while preserving historical memory of state attempts to control human emotional autonomy through systematic killing of individuals whose romantic relationships challenged official policies regarding appropriate sexual behavior and emotional expression that authorities considered essential for maintaining social order through violent elimination of dangerous romantic freedom. You witness the medieval church's systematic campaign against Valentine's Day celebrations as religious authorities recognize romantic love as theological threat that diverts human devotion from divine worship toward earthly, emotional attachments that compete with spiritual salvation for believers' primary loyalty, creating ecclesiastical war against romantic expression that employs excommunication, physical punishment, and sophisticated propaganda to eliminate Valentine's Day traditions that church leadership considers spiritually dangerous forms of idolatry disguised as innocent seasonal celebration. Your medieval parish experiences coordinated suppression of Valentine's Day activities as church authorities ban romantic gift-giving, prohibit love poetry, and criminalize courtship behaviors that occur during February festivities, while priests deliver sermons that explicitly condemn romantic love as satanic deception designed to trap souls in earthly passion that prevents spiritual focus required for divine salvation. The Church essentially declares war on human emotional expression by treating romantic attachment as competing religion that requires violent suppression to protect Christian souls from spiritual contamination through dangerous emotional experiences. The mainstream historical fact governing church opposition to Valentine's Day reveals that religious authorities regularly issued official denunciations of romantic celebrations during February. Papal records document systematic attempts to eliminate Valentine's Day traditions through ecclesiastical law that criminalized romantic behavior while threatening excommunication for believers who participated in love celebrations that church leadership considered incompatible with Christian spiritual development. Archaeological evidence from medieval monasteries shows destroyed romantic artifacts and banned love literature, suggesting that religious oppression of Valentine's Day involved systematic elimination of romantic cultural materials. You observe the violent enforcement of church Valentine's Day bans as religious authorities coordinate with secular officials to identify and punish believers who maintain forbidden romantic traditions through surveillance networks that monitor private romantic behaviour while imposing spiritual penalties that include denial of sacraments, excommunication from a religious community, and eternal damnation for souls who choose earthly love over divine devotion. Church enforcement essentially creates a religious police state where romantic expression becomes evidence of spiritual rebellion, requiring immediate intervention to prevent romantic contamination from spreading through Christian communities. Your medieval church's anti-Valentines campaign includes elaborate theological arguments that present romantic love as theological error that misleads believers into worshipping human emotions rather than maintaining proper spiritual focus on divine love that requires rejection of earthly emotional attachments, including romantic relationships that church authorities consider dangerous distractions from spiritual development that leads to salvation through complete devotion to religious rather than romantic purposes. A quirky aspect of church opposition to Valentine's Day emerges from the alternative spiritual celebrations that religious authorities attempt to substitute for banned romantic traditions, including special prayer services designed to redirect emotional energy toward divine worship, religious festivals that compete with romantic celebrations for community attention, and spiritual exercises that supposedly provide superior emotional satisfaction compared to dangerous romantic experiences that threaten spiritual welfare. Some medieval churches apparently developed comprehensive romantic replacement programs that offered religious alternatives to banned emotional activities, though their success rates remain unclear given persistent popularity of forbidden romantic celebrations. You discover that church suppression of Valentine's Day includes systematic destruction of romantic literature, confiscation of love tokens, and forced public confession of romantic sins by believers who participated in forbidden emotional activities that religious authorities consider equivalent to witchcraft or heretical worship of false idols. Religious romantic prohibition essentially treats human emotional expression as criminal activity requiring confession, penance, and spiritual rehabilitation to restore proper Christian focus on divine rather than earthly love relationships. The theological basis for church opposition to Valentine's Day includes sophisticated religious arguments that present romantic love as a spiritual trap designed by Satan to prevent believers from achieving salvation through complete devotion to God that romantic relationships supposedly undermine through divided loyalty between earthly emotional attachments and heavenly spiritual obligations. Church romantic theology essentially argues that human love competes with divine love in zero-sum spiritual economy, where romantic attachment reduces spiritual capacity for religious devotion. Your medieval religious community experiences social division as church romantic prohibition creates conflicts between official religious policy and popular romantic traditions that believers want to maintain despite ecclesiastical threats of spiritual punishment, with some community members secretly maintaining Valentine's Day celebrations, while others embrace church anti-romantic campaigns through religious conviction or fear of spiritual consequences. Church romantic warfare essentially splits religious communities between official spiritual policy and popular emotional traditions that compete for believers' loyalty. The enforcement mechanisms that churches develop for Valentine's Day suppression include specialized confession procedures designed to identify romantic sinners, religious courts that prosecute romantic crimes against spiritual law, and penitential systems that impose spiritual punishment for romantic behavior while attempting to rehabilitate believers whose emotional attachments threaten their spiritual salvation through earthly romantic distractions from proper religious focus. Your observation of church romantic propaganda reveals sophisticated theological arguments designed to convince believers that romantic love represents spiritual danger rather than innocent emotional experience. with religious education that teaches congregations to fear romantic attachment as satanic deception, while promoting spiritual love as superior alternative that provides genuine emotional satisfaction without threatening eternal salvation through dangerous earthly emotional attachments. The seasonal patterns of church romantic suppression include intensified religious campaigns during February, when authorities anticipate increased romantic activity requiring extra spiritual vigilance to prevent Valentine's Day celebrations from contaminating Christian communities through emotional activities that compete with religious devotion for believers' primary spiritual loyalty and emotional energy that should be directed toward divine rather than human love relationships. The psychological impact of church romantic prohibition includes believers who develop spiritual guilt about natural human emotional experiences while struggling to reconcile religious teachings that condemn romantic love with personal emotional needs that romantic relationships fulfill in ways that purely spiritual activities often cannot provide effectively. Church anti-romantic campaigns essentially create psychological conflicts between religious obligation and human emotional nature that many believers find impossible to resolve satisfactorily. The resistance to church Valentine's Day suppressions includes underground religious communities that maintain both Christian faith and romantic traditions through theological interpretations that present human love as compatible with divine worship rather than competing spiritual loyalty, creating alternative Christian communities that reject official church romantic prohibition while maintaining religious conviction through different theological understanding of relationships between earthly and spiritual love. Historians still argue whether church opposition to Valentine's Day represented a legitimate spiritual concern about competing loyalties or institutional attempt to control human emotional expression for political purposes disguised as religious guidance. But evidence suggests that religious romantic prohibition reflected genuine theological conviction that romantic love threatened spiritual salvation while creating systematic conflict between church authority and popular emotional traditions that believers considered harmless seasonal celebrations. You understand that medieval church opposition to Valentine's Day creates fundamental conflict between religious authority and human emotional needs, with ecclesiastical romantic prohibition essentially declaring war on natural human emotional expression while claiming spiritual justification for suppressing emotional experiences that provide meaning and satisfaction that purely religious activities often cannot replace effectively, making church romantic campaigns ultimately unsuccessful despite systematic effort to eliminate dangerous earthly love through religious violence and spiritual intimidation. You trace the disturbing legacy of medieval Valentine's Day terror through centuries of cultural transmission that preserves dangerous romantic traditions disguised as harmless holiday celebration. Understanding how ancient fears about deadly love potions, violent courtship, and supernatural romantic dangers continue influencing contemporary relationship anxieties that many modern people experience without understanding their historical origins in medieval romance culture that treated love as literally life-threatening force requiring careful management to prevent romantic emotions from triggering violence, death, or spiritual destruction. Your modern Valentine's Day carries invisible inheritance from medieval romantic terror through cultural patterns that persist despite technological and social changes that have eliminated most obvious dangers while preserving psychological frameworks that continue treating romantic relationships as potential sources of extreme danger, obsessive behavior, and emotional manipulation that contemporary people recognize as unhealthy relationship dynamics without connecting these patterns to historical romantic traditions that explicitly celebrated stalking, possession, and violent competition as proof of authentic love. The mainstream historical fact connecting medieval romantic terror to contemporary Valentine's anxiety reveals that modern relationship problems often reflect cultural inheritance from historical periods when romantic love was explicitly associated with violence, death, and supernatural danger. Psychological research shows that contemporary Valentine's Day consistently triggers increased rates of domestic violence, stalking behavior, and romantic obsession that mirror medieval patterns of dangerous courtship while demonstrating how historical romantic models continue influencing modern relationship expectations despite legal and social changes designed to protect individual emotional autonomy. You observe how contemporary Valentine's Day marketing inadvertently preserves medieval romantic terror through advertising that emphasizes possessive love, dramatic romantic gestures, and relationship intensity that mirrors historical courtly love traditions, while commercial romantic culture continues promoting relationship models based on male pursuit and feminine submission that medieval literature explicitly celebrated as ideal romantic behavior. Modern romantic commerce essentially markets historical romantic dysfunction as traditional relationship values, while obscuring the violence and coercion that characterized original medieval romantic traditions. Your analysis of contemporary Valentine's Day reveals persistent cultural patterns that reflect medieval understanding of romantic love as dangerous emotional force, requiring external control and social management, with modern relationship advice, legal systems, and therapeutic interventions addressing romantic problems that medieval people would recognize as predictable consequences of treating love as potentially destructive power that threatens individual welfare and social stability when not properly contained through community oversight. A quirky aspect of medieval romantic legacy emerges from contemporary romantic traditions that unknowingly recreate historical patterns of dangerous courtship behavior, including Valentine's Day practices that encourage romantic persistence despite rejection, gift-giving that mirrors medieval love token rituals, and relationship escalation patterns that follow medieval courtly love progression from idealization through obsession to possession. Modern romantic culture apparently preserves medieval romantic dysfunction through traditional practices that contemporary people interpret as harmless holiday customs, while unconsciously maintaining historical patterns of unhealthy relationship dynamics. You discover that contemporary romantic literature, films, and media continue promoting relationship models directly inherited from medieval romantic traditions that celebrated stalking, emotional manipulation, and possessive behavior as evidence of passionate love, with popular romantic entertainment teaching audiences to interpret controlling behavior as romantic devotion, while failing to recognize these patterns as cultural inheritance from historical periods when romantic violence received social approval rather than legal prohibition. The psychological mechanisms through which medieval romantic terror influences contemporary relationships include cultural transmission of romantic expectations that normalize possessive behavior, emotional manipulation, and relationship control as expressions of passionate love rather than warning signs of abusive relationships, with modern people learning to mistake intensity for authenticity while interpreting dramatic romantic gestures as evidence of devotion rather than recognizing them as potential indicators of unhealthy relationship dynamics that medieval people explicitly celebrated. Your contemporary Valentine's Day experience includes unconscious recreation of medieval romantic rituals through gift-giving patterns, relationship timing, and romantic behavior that follows historical templates, despite modern legal and social changes that prohibit most obvious forms of romantic violence while preserving cultural frameworks that continue promoting relationship models based on medieval understanding of love as conquering force that overcomes resistance through persistent pursuit regardless of consent or mutual compatibility. The therapeutic implications of understanding medieval romantic legacy include recognition that contemporary relationship problems often reflect cultural inheritance rather than individual psychological dysfunction, with relationship therapy addressing romantic patterns that originated in historical periods when violent courtship received social approval, while modern people struggle with relationship expectations derived from medieval romantic culture that explicitly contradicted contemporary values of mutual respect and consensual emotional connection. Your observation of modern Valentine's Day commerce reveals how commercial romantic culture continues profiting from medieval romantic dysfunction through marketing that promotes dramatic romantic gestures, expensive gift-giving, and relationship intensity that mirrors historical courtly love traditions, while obscuring the violence and coercion that characterized original romantic models that contemporary advertising unconsciously preserves through traditional holiday practices. The legal dimensions of medieval romantic legacy include contemporary domestic violence laws, stalking legislation, and relationship protection systems that specifically address romantic behaviours that medieval culture celebrated as proof of authentic love. With modern legal systems essentially criminalising romantic practices that historical societies endorsed as appropriate courtship methods, while protecting individual autonomy that medieval romantic traditions systematically violated through community-approved romantic violence. The educational aspects of understanding medieval Valentine's terror include developing historical literacy about romantic traditions that helps contemporary people recognise unhealthy relationship patterns as cultural inheritance rather than inevitable romantic experience. With historical knowledge providing perspective that allows modern individuals to distinguish between authentic emotional connection and culturally transmitted romantic dysfunction that masquerades as traditional relationship values. Historians still argue whether medieval romantic terror directly influences contemporary relationship problems, or whether modern romantic difficulties reflect universal human relationship challenges that coincidentally resemble historical patterns. But evidence suggests that cultural transmission of romantic expectations creates persistent relationship problems that therapy and legal intervention struggle to address without understanding their historical origins in medieval romantic culture that treated dangerous love as normal romantic experience. You understand that recognizing medieval Valentine's terror as foundation for contemporary romantic culture provides tools for developing healthier relationship patterns that honor authentic emotional connection while rejecting cultural inheritance of romantic violence. Manipulation and possession that medieval people celebrated as ideal love, but that modern understanding recognizes as relationship dysfunction requiring conscious cultural change to eliminate historical romantic patterns that continue causing unnecessary suffering in contemporary relationships. The transformative potential of understanding medieval romantic legacy includes possibility for contemporary people to consciously choose relationship models based on mutual respect and consensual emotional connection, rather than unconsciously recreating historical romantic patterns that prioritize dramatic intensity over genuine compatibility, while teaching generations of lovers to mistake possession for passion and control for caring in ways that continue influencing modern relationship expectations despite social progress that should have eliminated medieval romantic dysfunction. As you settle into peaceful sleep, understanding the dark history that lurks beneath Valentine's Day's romantic surface, you carry new awareness of how ancient fears and violent traditions continue shaping contemporary relationships in subtle but significant ways. The gentle darkness around you feels protective now, free from the supernatural terrors that once made February nights dangerous for medieval lovers, while your modern comfort contrasts sharply with the blood-soaked origins of the holiday that has somehow transformed from celebration of martyrdom and violence into symbol of gentle affection. Your breathing slows naturally as you release the weight of these disturbing historical truths. Understanding that knowledge of Valentine's Day's scary past need not diminish your appreciation for love's genuine beauty when expressed through mutual respect and consensual emotional connection, rather than the possessive violence that characterized medieval romance. The soft sounds around you, perhaps gentle rain or distant traffic, create peaceful atmosphere that medieval lovers could rarely enjoy during February nights filled with supernatural dangers and romantic terrors that made love literally life-threatening. Your consciousness drifts toward rest with deeper appreciation for how much human relationships have evolved beyond the dangerous patterns that once made Valentine's Day a season of fear rather than celebration, while understanding that this historical knowledge empowers you to recognize and reject unhealthy romantic traditions that continue influencing contemporary culture in ways that most people never realize. Sleep comes gently now, carrying you away from a medieval romantic terrors into dreams where love exists safely within frameworks of mutual respect and emotional authenticity. Sweet dreams of gentle love that honors rather than possesses, that builds rather than conquers, and that celebrates the beautiful vulnerability of human emotional connection freed from the violent expectations and supernatural fears that once made romance literally dangerous to pursue or experience.